Hello and welcome back to this latest episode of the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions show. I am Barbara Albert, co-CEO of 100% Renewables, a consultancy specialized in the development of climate action strategies. Today we're speaking with Lion, one of Australia's largest brewers, which employs more than 1,500 people. Lion produces iconic brands such as Toys, 4X, James Squire Zero, as well as craft beers such as Furphy and Little Creatures, cider, alcoholic seltzer, coffee and kombucha. Lion's environmental approach is governed by the simple mantra of reduce, reuse and recycle. As a large manufacturer and purchaser of agricultural goods, Lion's priorities are focused on reducing their water and energy use and waste. Lion has made great progress in emissions reduction and in 2020 became the country's first large-scale carbon-neutral brewer. As part of Lion's energy optimization program, they aim to brew all their beers using 100% renewable electricity by 2025. In New Zealand, Lion has achieved carbon zero certification with Toitu. And in the US, New Belgium has committed to eliminating carbon emissions by 2030. Beyond the gates of their breweries, Lion measures emissions up and down the supply chain and works with their partners to mitigate the carbon footprint of the inputs and the journey to the point of purchase. Joining me today is Justin Merrell. Justin is the Group Environment Director at Lion. He's responsible for setting Lion's environment strategy that focuses on carbon, sustainable packaging, and water stewardship. Prior to Lion, Justin held various roles in Qantas, but joined Qantas in 2012 as Group Environment Manager just in time to catch Australia's first biofuel flight. Prior to Qantas, he was Operations Manager at the Coppers Chemical Plant in Cornell for 11 years. Justin has a chemical engineering degree from the University of Newcastle and Master of Environmental Management from the University of New South Wales. Hi, Justin, and welcome to the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions show.
Thanks, Barbara. Pleasure to be here.
Being originally from Austria, which has a strong beer and wine culture, and as someone who enjoys drinking beer, I've been looking forward to hearing more about Lion's journey towards net zero emissions, Justin. Please tell us more about your company.
So Lion is one of the leading beverage companies in Australia and New Zealand. We produce mostly beer. Our brands, our well-known brands are 4X and Toys, Stein Lager in New Zealand. And as well as that, we have quite a few craft brands, James Squires, Little Creatures, Furphy, Byron Bay, Panhead. And also part of Lion, we have a company called Little World Beverages, where we have New Belgium Brewery in the USA and Magic Rock and 4 Pure craft breweries in the UK. And also a couple of wine businesses, as well as an interest in 4 Pillars Gin, which is doing really well in Australia at this point in time. That's the technical description. But I suppose, Lion as an organisation is a very genuine and transparent organisation. Our vision is to be sociable and live well, and we tend to look after each other in the company, which makes it a really good place to work.
So Lion is part of the Kirin group. What can you tell us about Lion's parent company?
So Kirin is based in Japan, as you've probably guessed. It's about 10 times the size of Lion in terms of employees, so it's quite a big company. It's a global company, but most of those people work out of Japan or in Australia. And again, the focus is on beer, but they also have a growing interest in the pharmaceuticals area, which is doing really well. They're listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, so they have investment criteria that they need to meet. And like Lion, they're very much committed to doing the right thing in the long term. And that's why we find we have good alignment with Kirin, particularly around sustainability.
I've always had a keen interest in finding out how products are made and how this results in carbon emissions. Back in 2016, when I wrote my book, Energy Unlimited, I visited one of Austria's largest breweries. And I saw firsthand what inputs, for instance, in terms of hops, barley, and other ingredients, as well as energy, are needed to produce beer, and the challenges involved in making beer production sustainable. Justin, can you tell our listeners more about how Lion operates with a specific focus on your land-to-hand approach? How do you produce your beverages, and how do these processes cause emissions?
So, as most people probably know, beer is made from barley, which is converted into malt, which is then fermented to make our product. So we use a lot of water, but in the carbon intensity point of view, there's emissions associated with agriculture. There's emissions associated with the packaging that we use. If you think about glass and aluminium, they're both quite carbon-intensive materials. Then we have the actual brewing process itself, which involves a little bit of steam and a little bit of electricity. And then, of course, we have to distribute that product to our customers. So we have some emissions associated with transportation.
Recently, the Working Group 1 of IPCC's 6th assessment reporting cycle was released, which issued the strongest call yet for urgent and deep cuts to be made to global greenhouse gas emissions. The report says that the window in which to deliver the deep emission cuts needed to prevent the worst impacts of climate change is closing rapidly. A key message from the report is that rapid reductions in emissions are required this decade to prevent long-term ecological and climate breakdown, with every fraction of a degree making a huge difference in avoiding a climate disaster. Do reports such as the recently released IPCC report affect your strategy? And what does showing up for climate action mean for your business?
So the IPCC report was obviously quite alarming, but at the same time not unexpected for us. So I guess we've had for a long period of time, we've believed the science, we've believed the forecast models, and we're now looking at the reality that some of those predictions that they've been telling us about for so many years are now becoming reality. So in a way that report is frustrating, but on the other hand, it's motivating. So I think it's important on climate change that you maintain a growth mindset, but at the same time, it's crucial to be grounded in the reality and the science as well. So I see it more as definitely not a wake-up call. We're aware of the issue, and again, I think on balance, it's motivating for us. And in terms of how do we stand up for climate change, that's a good question. With obviously lots of angles to it, I suppose. So I guess it's important to have some good governance in your company. I think it's good to set ambitious targets. I think it's good to be able to communicate those targets to employees. I feel it's good to engage your value chain, engage your suppliers, engage your customers on the types of opportunities that you can collaborate on. And fundamentally, it's just about acting. It's about pulling all the levers you have at your disposal, because, as you say, time has run out, and we must accelerate action and be doing everything that we can.
So, Justin, you mentioned your climate change targets. What are your climate change targets?
We have a few. I guess our headline aspiration is to be a net zero value chain by 2050. And we have science-based targets, which are cascaded from our parent company, Kirin. So they're set at the 1.5 degree global warming trajectory. So what that equates to in our business is that over the next 10 years, we'll reduce our direct emissions by 55%, and we'll reduce our scope 3 emissions by 30%. So we've got about 10 years to do that. We've also got a commitment to 100% renewable electricity in our operations by 2025. And we also set an energy efficiency target for the breweries to meet. And fundamentally, energy efficiency is always our number one priority. We focus on direct reduction above everything else. And energy efficiency obviously has that double win of actually reducing costs in the business as well. So that's always been the key focus for Lion.
You mentioned that the targets are set also at the global Kirin level. How does this influence leadership positions and actions on a local level in Australia and in New Zealand?
Well, look, I feel we're fortunate to have a parent company that's so ambitious on climate change. They ultimately, as I mentioned in the introduction, they're listed on the stock exchange, and they have investors in mind when they're making those commitments. And that flows through in terms of sets a standard, I suppose, for Lion to meet. Ultimately, the targets that Kirin is setting are very ambitious, and they require people to rethink how they're going to achieve such large numbers. You think about a 55% reduction in direct emissions, that's quite a challenge. And you have to think about, well, what are the financial hurdles that you're going to put in place to realise those types of reductions, but try and do it as financially rational as you possibly can. So the other high level opportunity that it creates with Kirin being our parent is that they see themselves as being a rule maker in this space. So they actually want to lead. They've signalled very clearly that they want to lead in shared value. They want to lead on climate change, and they want to make the rules for other companies to follow. So we feel very privileged to have that level of support behind us, because it gives us so much more opportunity to also take a leadership role and really push the boundaries on this particular issue.
I want to focus for a little bit on some of the external factors that may influence your strategy, such as what your competitors are doing. You mentioned science-based targets. There's the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, and there are the sustainable development goals, for example. So first up, what's happening in your sector? What are the trends, and how do those trends influence your strategy?
Well, look, overall, I feel the FMCG sector really punches above its weight. In my humble opinion, it's always been very aggressive on addressing these environmental issues and some social issues as well. So, and there's numerous large European brewers that are equally ambitious and transparent as Lion is, and they're doing some really good things, and we welcome that ultimately. I think it does create some healthy competition. And you can see, the various brewers responding to what other brewers are doing, particularly when they take a leadership position on a particular issue. So I really enjoy working in this industry because, as I said, they're really serious about giving this issue a nudge. In terms of how things have changed, I like to talk about the fact that back in the 60s and the 70s and 80s, it was all about minimising harm. In that you were legally allowed to pollute the environment because you had limits given to you by the government. So you could pollute the river, but you just couldn't do it too much. And I feel now we're in this phase of zero harm. We're hearing a lot about net zero and zero emissions, and so we're in this kind of all carbon neutral, going back to that sort of classic term. And the next phase for us is ultimately positive impact. So you can see this transition happening from minimising harm through to zero harm, which I think is quickly becoming table stakes for big companies. And then we get into this really exciting area around positive impact. So what can you actually do beyond just putting things back to normal? How can you actually generate a positive impact on the environment, or how can you generate a positive impact on society? And I feel that's a really healthy challenge. On the TCFD, Kirin signatory to that framework, and they are deploying that framework and have done for a number of years. So we feed into that process for them, and they became very aware of the water risks in Australia through that process. I think when they were looking at the climate models as part of the risks and opportunities assessment, they realised that they had ownership of a large brewer in a very water stressed environment, that is Australia. And so they've encouraged us to conduct water stewardship reports and analysis to get a better understanding of where the risks are. So my personal view on TCFD, I feel it's a really good mechanism to draw the finance teams into the climate change action space. I still feel that the quantification of that financial risk isn't quite there. It still feels a little bit loose. I think it's getting stronger, but at the same time, I still feel that people are struggling to really quantify climate risks in terms of dollars. And there might be some people on this call from the insurance industry that will probably strongly disagree. That's one area that's certainly feeling the impact of extreme weather events. But for a beer maker, it's a curious situation because the barley yields have never been better. And that's somewhat counterintuitive as, weather is becoming more, uncertain and extreme weather events are occurring more frequently. But at the same time, barley yields have never been better. And that's a consequence of barley breeding. So they've recognised the changes in the climate, and this obviously is what I'm talking about here is climate resilience, but they've been able to adapt really well to, increasing temperatures, reduced rainfall, extended, drought periods, and being able to breed barley that's suitable or is at least tolerant of those conditions. So it's really interesting that we talk about TCFD and risks, and on the other hand, barley industry has probably never been stronger. And you try and marry those two together, and you think, well, how do I quantify this? Because at some point, you'll reach a limit with that barley breeding as to there'll be a temperature or there'll be a drought tolerance that they can no longer meet. So it's just, as I said, for me, it just feels a little bit, it still feels a little bit loose, and it's obviously very dependent on your geography and dependent on your, the type of ingredients that you're using. And just to round this out, we went through a sale recently. Lion used to have another part of the company, Lion Dairy and Drinks, which was mainly milk and cheese. And we sold that business last year, but we sold it during one of the worst droughts in Victoria. And we had to adjust the price, the business to reflect those sort of climatic conditions, if you like. So it's really interesting when I reflect on that. I'm not sure how much they were aware of it at the time. But yeah, ultimately we wrote down the price of that business as a consequence of the climate and the type of yields that the dairy farmers were producing during that time of extreme drought. So it's, humans respond very quickly to an immediate threat, but we're typically very slow to a threat that's just creeping up on us that we can't see. And of course, that is, climate change in a nutshell, isn't it? So that's why I feel that the TCFD is very important in terms of engaging the finance teams. But I think we still have some way to go before we can, accurately quantify some of those risks.
I would like to dive deeper into physical climate risks a bit later. But what's your opinion on the Sustainable Development Goals? Is that something that you integrate in your business? And if you do, which one of those SDGs would you consider core to your business that you're trying to align yourself with?
Look, I think the SDGs are a great marker. We don't refer to them on a daily basis. I think they've set a really good framework. And ultimately, if you dig deep into our strategy, you'll find strong alignment to, affordable and clean energy, for example, clean water and sanitation would be another one. Responsible consumption, which applies to both the use of our resources as well as the use of our product. Life on the land is another one that springs to mind, decent work and economic growth. So again, we have a very strong view around modern slavery We've just commenced the reconciliation action plan as well. So they're probably the ones that innovation and infrastructure, I'm aware, is another one. So that's, again, we tend to try and stay ahead of the technology, and quite happy to pilot innovation, whether it be around, making a better beer, or whether it be doing it with less carbon emissions. So I suppose it's the obvious ones, Barbara. As I said, it's the water and the land and the clean energy and just being responsible.
So peer performance, the SDGs and TCFD, and these are all a lot of external drivers that influence your business. Internally, how do you manage all those different drivers, and how do you keep track of progress and reporting against all of these frameworks?
Well, we try and keep it as simple as possible. We really deliberately try to limit the number of measures that we report against. Otherwise, it just becomes overwhelming. And to be honest, you become too distracted with reporting against metrics and actually delivering improved performance. And so since I started at Lion about 3 years ago, I think I've been sort of working behind the scenes just to try and minimise the number of measures or the KPIs that we have in the business. Make sure we know how they're calculated, make sure I have a good understanding of the uncertainty around the numbers we're presenting, but ultimately keep them to, a very limited number to keep it manageable, because it can get away from you really quickly, and it can become quite a distraction. So at this point in time, I have 3 key metrics that I report to the board on a quarterly basis. And so far that seems to be working well. And one's around climate, one's around packaging, and one's around water. And there's also another one around environmental governance as well, which kind of really underpins everything that we do. We, as I said, keeping it simple, so as it doesn't become a distraction, would be my advice there.
It must be really hard to be facing such complexity, and then to be able to condense it into the 3 most important ones that you report on in your company. That must have been a difficult process.
Yeah, and again, I think it comes back to just having a good understanding of how those numbers are aggregated, because obviously we have to roll those numbers up across industries or breweries in the US and New Zealand and Australia, and we also want to make sure that it's driving the right curiosity and the right questions from the board. I think there's a lot of reporting which goes on just for the sake of reporting. And again, it can become a distraction, but if you keep the information punchy and relevant and use it as a means to engage, those senior executives in the business, then it works both ways. It opens that communication, whether it be around water stewardship or climate change or packaging. It's just ultimately trying to drive a healthy dialogue and keeping people curious as to how the company's performing.
And of course, it's giving the board reassurance that you're implementing all the projects that you have in your plan and that you're meeting all your targets.
Yes, and we're very transparent. It wouldn't give me any concern to report an amber initiative if something's gone off track. So we sort of welcome an open conversation as to how to get things right. Yep.
And going back to your earlier comments, which were so insightful about the physical climate risk, you were talking about how the valuation of the dairy business was affected because of the drought. And obviously, as a society, we're already experiencing many other severe weather events, droughts you've mentioned, but then we've had the horrible bushfires. There's floods, there's severe storms, and we can feel those impacts around the globe. And businesses are increasingly looking at those transition risks and physical risks, both in their supply chain and in the operations, sometimes in the downstream impacts. Can you dive a little bit deeper into the physical climate risks that are most relevant both to Lion and Kirin? How have you gone about assessing these? And how are they informing your business strategy going forward?
Yeah, so again, water security. And a curious fact about beer is that while we use a lot of water at our breweries, Tui's, for example, it typically uses over 1 billion litres of water per year. But the scary thing is that, that beer, it's only 2% of the water that's consumed is consumed at the breweries. 98% of the water that's consumed is actually consumed upstream in agriculture and the growing of the ingredients. So
that is an amazing insight.
Yeah, so think about 98% of the water used in brewing a beer is actually used upstream, and we use a lot, in the breweries. So that gives you a bit of an idea. Water security is it always floats to the top, if you like, and when you're looking at climate risks. But as I said, it's somewhat been diffused by the efficiency of the barley industry, and Australia being as vast as it is, quite often if one region's in a difficult situation, another region's doing quite well. So it kind of evens out, and as I said before, it's quite resilient to a point, I suspect. And I haven't seen what happens at that point and beyond that point. That's probably quite a scary proposition that we will need to look very closely at in the coming years. We did see impact of the bushfires in terms of logistics. So getting supplies to the brewery, getting our product to the pubs, particularly those in those areas where it was really needed at that point in time to give the people that were fighting the fires and were impacted by the fires some relief. So I think that's one area where we didn't anticipate, but those types of events can impact logistics and supply. As I said, the carbon intensity of the products. I think if you look at glass bottle, it's basically produced out of a furnace which is run on natural gas. So that's an area which is always, I guess, subject to risks from regulations. So a carbon price, for example, is going to have an impact on those types of processes. And I feel the other one is, again, comes back to agriculture, is probably unsustainable agriculture practices, where what the farmers are doing at this point in time, just won't be sufficient to be able to absorb the impact of changing climates, and making sure that we're preparing the agriculture businesses for those forthcoming extreme weather events and getting them through those.
So there is, of course, preparation for all those adverse events and shortages to come. So that's one side of the equation. But of course, there's lots of opportunities, like you mentioned, the increased barley yield with increased temperatures. Are there any other opportunities that you see with climate change?
Well, look, I think there's a lot of discussion at the moment around regenerative agriculture. I think there's a lot of discussion in general about regeneration at this point in time. So, but I feel regenerative agriculture should be front of mind, and I feel it is front of mind. Even for the coalition government, they're quite open in discussing the benefits of replenishing agricultural land with carbon. They're quite open to discussing the impact of soil carbon, sequestration, and the impact it has on drought tolerance and biodiversity, increasing the yields and pest resilience, and those types of opportunities where you see this, double benefit of, I guess, abating carbon, but at the same time regenerating or restoring agricultural lands to where they should be, to promote resilience, but also to promote, a healthy, steady yield of crops going forward. So that is one area which I'm quite excited about and quite enthused about, because, as I said, I feel it can do so many things. It's something that we can do beyond just addressing the carbon imbalance in the atmosphere. It's actually accepting that the European farming practices that have been, introduced to Australia are not actually suitable for our climate and our environment, and there's other ways we can be doing things which are a lot more, sustainable.
So you mentioned increasing soil carbon. How does this actually work, so that our listeners have a better understanding of how agriculture can actually contribute to a more sustainable world?
It's ultimately, as you till the soil during a lot of agriculture practices, you're releasing carbon to atmosphere. And that's why, if you look at global carbon emissions, agriculture, sits at about 20% as a consequence of those practices. So soil carbon sequestration is about putting carbon back in the earth, and that can be biochars, it can be other types of biomass, but it's ultimately replenishing the soil with the nutrients that it needs to, sustain ongoing farming. So it is actually a carbon abatement methodology, or a carbon offset methodology in the Australian law. The Carbon Farming Initiative, as it used to be known. It's just challenging in a sense. It's very hard to measure soil carbon. So it's very hard to put the science around how much of an impact you've actually made through, injecting soil or replenishing the farmland with biomass. So I feel that and there's work going on now with CSIRO for them to be able to make the measurement of carbon in soil more cost effective. And once we're able to measure it, I feel that'll unlock a lot more activity in that space. It will open up a new opportunity to purchase carbon offsets or Australian carbon credit units.
And for farmers to generate carbon offsets, because if you've got a measurement methodology, it all makes it so much easier.
Well, it does. It doesn't replace their income, but I feel like it'd be nice to have that cream on top, so to speak. And maybe the driver for them isn't, the dollar from the carbon credit. Maybe the driver for them, as I said, is improving the drought tolerance of their soil, or improving the pest resistance of their crops, or just improving the yield in general as a consequence of having more carbon in the soil. Yeah. So there's multiple drivers.
Yeah, lots of co-benefits.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I want to come back to your operations and your supply chain emissions. From our discussions earlier, I understand that about half of your Scope 3 emissions come from packaging, about 20 to 25% from agricultural inputs, such of the ones that we've just discussed. And I think similarly, 20% of your emissions come from transport, mostly from downstream. And only 20% of your emissions overall come from your manufacturing processes, which is something that might surprise some of our listeners. So going to the emissions from packaging, how are you working to reduce those emissions? Is it possible to reduce emissions from packaging?
Absolutely, and it is. And I think to put all those numbers you just relayed, Barbara, into context, if you hold a bottle of beer in your hand, about 50% of the emissions, the life cycle emissions in that beer, are the glass bottle itself. So if we're focusing on reducing our Scope 3 emissions, we would tend to hunt in that packaging space. And in particular, we'd go to glass as the single biggest emission in our Scope 3 footprint. So, but the good news is for glass is that the more recycled content that you can put in glass, the lower the energy required to make that glass. So there's this direct correlation between recycled content and carbon emissions. That is, the higher the recycled content in your glass, the lower the carbon emissions. And again, that has a benefit for the glass producers, in that the more glass bottles, or glass cullet as it's called in the business, the more recycled glass you can get into that furnace, the lower their energy costs and therefore the lower the carbon emissions. So there's this beautiful nexus between the circular economy and carbon, because the more that we can get consumers to be using those container deposit schemes or putting their bottles in their yellow bin, the lower the carbon footprint of the glass bottle that we're going to use in our production. So
maybe some overseas listeners that don't know what the container deposit scheme is, could you expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, so it's a refund scheme. So you buy a bottle of beer, and then once you've finished consuming that beer, you have the option of taking it. There's numerous schemes set up in Australia. In New South Wales, where I live, they can take that bottle back to what they call a reverse vending machine, and they get 10 cents for that bottle. And so that's a way of encouraging consumers to recycle. And it's also a way to try and minimise the littering. So it seems to be working quite well. I mean, one of the amazing statistics we have in South Australia, and the South Australian Container Deposit Scheme has been operating for a very long time, for decades, and it's probably the poster child when it comes to container deposit schemes in Australia, in that we know for a fact that over 85% of the containers that we put on the market in South Australia are returned through that scheme. So, you think about that, 85% of the cans and the bottles that we put on the shelves are finding their way back, in the container deposit schemes, and they're being turned into new glass bottles, or in the case of aluminium, other types of aluminium products. So an incredibly high, recycling rate for our packaging. And, again, it's really important from a circular economy point of view, and it's equally important from a carbon intensity point of view. And so you have, New Zealand recycled content in glass is, above 60%. In Japan, it's above 70%. And dare say in Germany, it's at least above 70% as well. In Australia, we're catching up, but we're catching up quickly. And so, as I said, it's a really important relationship between improving the recycling and also lowering the emissions of our products. So that's packaging. And one of our key goals in packaging is, obviously, wouldn't be surprising then that we set a recycled content target. So we want to be over, greater than 55% over in the next 3 years. And we want to have all our packaging recyclable. And as I said, fortunately, we're in a good position because we use kegs and we use cans and we use bottles, and they're all, recyclable many, many times over. The other scope 3 that you spoke about, obviously the ingredients, and we spoke a little bit about agriculture and how that process leads to carbon emissions. There's some good work being undertaken with some of our, and one thing I should point out too is that, we don't use barley in beer making. We use malt. Malt is modified barley. So the barley comes from the farms, it goes to the maltsters, and then it goes from the maltsters to the breweries. But we're working with some very forward-thinking malt suppliers like Bort Malt, who are quite heavily invested into that barley farming space, and working with those farmers to look at regenerative agriculture and even look at carbon neutral barleys. And obviously that's something that we're very keen to explore with them and ultimately get our hands on. So we feel like there is some good work being done in that agricultural area. And similarly with the distribution, like you say, like most of the scope 3 involved for the logistics is the transportation of our product from the breweries to the customers. And you can see there, once again, Australia is probably a little bit behind Europe in terms of the uptake of electric vehicles and other types of fuel sources for large trucks. But we're just starting to see the emergence of electric vehicles, and it's more and more in the media. But we're actually going to be running a trial next month. So we're slowly getting up to speed with where Europe are, and again, that provides a really good opportunity to reduce the scope 3 emissions in that area. Really, really fortunate, I must say, with making beer in Australia our scope 3 emissions are really confined to a handful of local companies. So we're in this really, you think about Visi as a major packaging supplier, or Bort Malt as a major malt supplier, Linfox, major transporter. So there's, 3 companies that probably contribute over, 60% of our scope 3 emissions. So really privileged to be able to just concentrate on 3 suppliers and be able to have a conversation about how we can work together to reduce carbon.
How does this conversation happen between you and the suppliers? Who's driving the agenda? Is it, Linfox, of course, they have their own sustainability agenda, but they're working with you, the malt supplier. How does this conversation happen? Who's driving the change? Is it, can we envisage that as a cooperative effort? Do you get together and meet and discuss initiatives you can implement together? Do you present your carbon footprint and then talk to your suppliers and they can help you reduce that scope 3 footprint? How does that happen in reality?
Well, I think you basically hit the nail on the head. I don't feel there's any, and this is now moving to that area of partnerships, which I think is absolutely critical to where the next step is. Like if you ask me, and you might ask me later on in this interview where the next step is, I will tell you it's about partnerships. It's about collaboration. You're at this stage now where, as I said, if you want to do positive impact, the government's not going to write legislation for you to do positive impact, right? There's not going to be laws that force you to into that position. That's a position you're going to get to voluntarily. And if you're going to have a maximum impact in making something positive as opposed to net zero, then you're going to have maximum impact by doing it with other corporations or other companies. So it's a really obvious area to hunt, particularly if like Lion, you're a carbon neutral organisation. So you feel you've got your scope 1 and 2 under control, and now the next big feast is going to be around scope 3. And for that, you've got to open the conversation with the suppliers. And yes, it can be as simple as getting together in the boardroom and scratching out where the overlap is and where the collaboration opportunities might reside. Now, the glass one we spoke about earlier is really obvious. I mean, Lion is actually running collection companies in South Australia and are quite heavily invested in the container deposit schemes. So we can actually influence those schemes to provide the glass to the glass bottle manufacturers and pull down the carbon intensity. But just actually outlaying that circularity and identifying where the advantages are and where the opportunities are, that's often all it takes for the light to go off. So it's about being transparent as well. It's about being genuine. It's about going into those conversations with a good track record. So you can actually point to a strategy. You can say, and this is where carbon neutral, which we'll come to, but you can walk into that boardroom with legitimacy and say, well, yeah, we're doing this, but we're going to work with you to do that. So that's for me is where the opportunity is. But being transparent, being genuine, being open to the commercial implications that might arise from those discussions. I mean, it's inevitable that dollars get involved, and this is where it's important to take the procurement team on the journey with you as well, or even better, get the procurement team to lead these types of conversations. You can write it into your procurement contracts. You can also put it into, responsible sourcing codes, but it can't beat, a face-to-face conversation around, this is our ambition around climate. What's yours? How can we work together?
Amazing. So we talked a lot about your suppliers and that manufacturing makes up such a small part in comparison of your carbon footprint, but focusing exactly on your operations, which is so much more under your control. You've been working on your energy management through decades now, through programs such as the Energy Efficiency Opportunities Act, the Energy Savings Action Plan, the Greenhouse Challenge. You've been reporting under the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme for many years. Can you tell us a little bit more about your energy management journey, the successes you've had, the challenges that you've encountered. And you mentioned the metrics previously, but could you dive more into the specific metrics you're using for your energy efficiency in your business?
Yeah, so the metric is very easy. It's just gigajoules per kiloliter of beer produced. And a lot of brewers around the world use that metric, and it's quite easy to benchmark your performance against other breweries. And we do, obviously. And we do okay. In fact, most of our breweries are, above average in terms of energy efficiency, which is good. Energy efficiency in gigajoules per kiloliter is very dependent on the amount of beer that you make. And as you can imagine, the bigger the factory, and let's face it, big breweries are factories. The bigger the factory, typically the better efficiency that you can achieve. If you're running a brewery that's just making one product day in, day out, you're going to have the best chance of getting a really high energy efficiency. So we keep that in mind when comparing breweries against breweries. But yeah, ultimately it just comes down to the amount of energy you've used per unit of beer that you produced. And again, keep it simple. And there's 1,000 factors you could throw at me now to say how that result's going to be skewed, and how it might misrepresent what the brewery's actually performing. But in my mind, that's just a distraction. Here's your metric, here's your target. Come up with a pipeline of initiatives that you're going to implement that's going to meet that target. And that's really what we do. We're really lucky that we've got some incredible passion within our people at the breweries. I'm not sure why, to be honest with you. I think I'd like to say that there's obviously good leadership before my time, I think, which has driven them into that position. But they're highly motivated. They're highly energized. They get together month after month. They talk as a collective. So there's a group of people called Lion Energy Champions, all the breweries are represented, and they get together every month and they talk about where the next, energy savings is going to come from. And they do an exceptional job. I mean, since 2015, we've reduced our direct emissions by 28%. And most of that has come from energy efficiency gains. And it starts really simple with the LED lighting and variable speed drives and air leaks and those types of things. But now we're sort of going into that new technology space, such as using things like heat pumps, installing solar on top of some of the breweries where it makes commercial sense to do it. So it's just they're in a really good cadence, and they have a really good passion to reducing carbon and reducing costs ultimately.
You mentioned solar on roofs. Obviously, energy supply side options have become so much more feasible in the last few years, not just on-site solar on roofs, but also biogas from on-site waste or renewable energy power purchasing, and potentially even green gas purchasing. How do you engage with these opportunities, and what sort of benefits is it bringing to your business?
So on the solar front, we have solar on the Forex Brewery, and we have it on the Little Creatures Brewery down in Geelong. And we did get some assistance from the Victorian Regional Development Fund for that installation at Geelong. So as you can imagine, the further south you go, the less output you achieve on solar panels. But, very important that, you're doing something, whether it's, even if it's half the efficiency of, panels up on a brewery in Brisbane, it's still something that's worth doing from a carbon abatement point of view. So we have those. We're looking at it at TUIs. Again, we do sustainability properly. We look for a financial, benefit as well as an environmental benefit. Social benefits are a little bit tough to find in solar, but can be achieved if you look at the broader PPA scenario, which we did with New South Wales. So we have a 100% renewable power purchase agreement in New South Wales, supplying the TUIs Brewery and a few of our other craft breweries, as well as our office at Olympic Park. And we did something quite unique there in that we offered that opportunity up to our customers through the Australian Hotel Association. So not only could Lion buy into that scheme, but also the customers could buy into that scheme as well. And we were, I guess, a cornerstone, party for that particular power purchase agreement. So that was something.
It's interesting. How did you get that off the ground? That's so good to hear. So did you go out by way of an EUI to all of your customers to see whether they wanted to add their energy consumption to your power purchase agreement? How did you go about that?
Well, it's driven out of the Australian Hotel Association, so the New South Wales branch of the AHA, where they could actually, seek interest from their members. And I think we had over 200, pubs or clubs, sign up to that PPA. So that was quite unique in that it was the first, industry sort of scale aggregated PPA, if you like. So it was quite exciting. And again, that's when I refer to, there can be social elements to some of these projects if you're clever enough to extract them. But it was, I'm making it sound, so easy, but it wasn't.
It's never easy with
I don't want to give the impression that it didn't take a hell of a lot of stakeholder management and people with different drivers and different needs.
Yes.
And I think we ultimately, the stars aligned and it got off the ground. But yeah, just a good example, a good story that you not only reduce your scope 3, but also be reducing your customers, scope 3 as well. So
I guess it's something that we'll see more of in the future as it all becomes easy. At the moment, it's still quite cumbersome. But as the market matures with power purchase agreements, as organizations become more used to it, I think there's going to be more of that bulk aggregated purchasing happening. At the moment, of course, there's still so many obstacles to overcome. So it's great to hear that you've offered that to your customers by way of reducing your downstream impact. So Justin, previously you mentioned the exciting fact that Lion is carbon neutral. So your business operates in many countries and you've obtained carbon neutral certifications for both products and for the organization itself. Now, there's lots of different schemes. In Australia, we have the climate active standards, different standards in New Zealand and in the States. How hard is it to go carbon neutral under all these different schemes, different countries, different standards? How did you find that process, and what are the main differences between the different certification schemes?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. Somewhat sympathetic question, I suspect, and I've never been asked that before, but it is. Each of the schemes have their own nuances, and they almost have their own culture. I mean, if you take Climate Active in Australia, they're a super helpful organisation, and they're really motivated by trying to make it as easy as possible for you to become a carbon neutral organisation or a carbon neutral product or event. So yes, they're just a really good bunch of people to work with. And Toitu in New Zealand, slightly different. They're probably a little bit more rigorous. They set the standard probably a touch higher than what Climate Active do. So they have slightly higher expectations. And in the US, there's not a lot of certified schemes in the US, believe it or not. So Australia and New Zealand are really running ahead relative to the US. And we certified the Fat Tire product out of the New Belgium brewery in the US. So that's the experience, the direct experience we have there. So, but I must say it's not that bad because it really all comes back to that greenhouse gas protocol. I mean, it's such an important document and really does, I guess, set the framework so that there's not a lot of debate or discussion around what's in and what's out. And I think, secondly, all schemes are quite specific about the types of offsets that you can use. So the offsets have to be, a certain standard for them to be, used in the scheme. So whilst there are some differences that can be frustrating, it could be a lot worse, and it's still all very achievable.
Great. Now, you mentioned previously carbon offset projects, which of course is a necessity when you are looking to become carbon neutral. You've got quite an exciting range of carbon offset projects that you're investing in, ranging from projects in Australia to overseas ones. Can you tell us more about the projects that you are currently investing in?
Yeah, so we buy our offsets through Tasman environmental markets here in Australia. So they've been around this space for a very long time. So they have good access to a wide variety of projects. We have, in terms of local ones, we have, my favourite one is the Indigenous fire management up in the savannas in the Northern Territory. So the cool burnings, as they're often referred to, which is really counterintuitive when people first hear about these projects where you actually, you're burning to save carbon. But of course, the concept's quite easy, is that you manage the fuel loads on the savannas such that they don't get to a point where they can develop into the wildfires and cause very, high amounts of carbon emissions, as well as, potential damage to, biodiversity and other, community infrastructure. So it's also a project which is obviously deeply connected to the Indigenous Australians and their practices that they've obviously been doing for tens of thousands of years. So for me, it's a really special project to be able to invest, our offset budget into Indigenous projects, which deliver not only environmental benefits, but some social benefit as well. And we also, in Australia, we have regeneration type projects where we're, focusing in on fencing off an area of bushland and making sure that's allowed to, develop naturally in terms of promoting that biodiversity. And again, a really important project for us because it's local, it's about the bush, it's about putting things back to the way that they were. And we have a similar project in New Zealand on the South Island with the Raracal forests in terms of making sure that they're protected and they're from logging and kept in their natural state. And we have a wind farm in India, and again, where these wind turbines have been put on farmland and the farmers get a percentage of the profit from the generation of electricity through those. So you can even hear the way I talk about these projects. I don't talk about the carbon. I talk about the co-benefits that they bring. And
that's so exciting. How do you make these decisions as a company to determine the values alignment of the carbon offset projects, looking at the co-benefits? What does this decision process look like at Lion?
Well, I think that's the key, Barbara, and I still think we're probably in the infancy of that process. The Indigenous fire management is very obvious because there's, as I said, we've just started that reconciliation action plan with Reconciliation Australia. So there's this really strong connection with our RAP. But I do feel there's opportunities for the brands, our brands to become involved in these discussions as well. So you will see, no doubt, over the next 10, 20 years, a lot of brands actually building sustainability into their purpose. And so what is that purpose? And does that purpose, align with a carbon offset project that we're actually using to get to a net zero organisation? So, and if you think about it, and going back to what I said about soil carbon, I mean, that's a beautiful story. That you imagine a scenario where you have a soil carbon sequestration project that we can actually invest in to be putting carbon back into agricultural land, which is growing the barley, which makes the malt, which makes the beer, which makes the carbon emissions that we offset via, this barley farm. Mm. So, you're in this, if you're brewing beer, you're in this really good sweet spot where you can actually be investing. You can be closing your carbon cycle by investing in offsets that are actually, saving carbon whilst you're growing barley. And that for me is really exciting.
outside of using carbon offsets, do you have a pathway towards net zero emissions that tries to minimize external carbon offset purchases, or is that not really important because you've got such great alignment with your carbon offset projects and you're doing so many amazing things?
Look, I've 2050 is our net zero value chain target, so I've got a fair amount of time, and I've drafted a high level roadmap to that outcome, and I'd estimate that by the time we get to 2050, it's probably 20%, less than 20%, of that net zero outcome is derived from carbon offsets. You just look at the pace at which renewable electricity is taking off. You talked about this green gas, which I hope you're right, and I think in probably 2 decades we'll have a pretty clear steer on what the possibilities are in that space. Because then you think about that in terms of there's scope 1, there's scope 2, and now you're into that scope 3, and where is it that electric vehicles can't meet the requirement, or where is it that you can't get enough recycled content into your glass, or where is it that the agricultural practices are so poor that you need to buy offsets to compensate for them? So to answer your question, I really feel that we're probably less than 20%, maybe more like 10% of that commitment's met through carbon offsets. But having said that, I think that's right. I would love for us to have that residual component because, as I said, I think offsets just offer so much more than just carbon. And, the demand for voluntary carbon offsets is increasing. It's going to push the price up and it's going to make it even more exciting. And there's going to be more different types of projects available, and there's going to be more co-benefits as a consequence. So, all this work that we're seeing now around natural capital markets, I mean, that's just glorious. We've been waiting 40 years to see that, like the internalisation of environmental costs. It finally feels like it's really close. Or think about nature-based solutions. Again, there's a ton of carbon there, but we're actually restoring these ecosystems back to the state that they should be, to sustain us into the future. So I just think it's, and that's why I get a little bit annoyed, when people, get down on offsets, because there are some dodgy ones out there. And, the answer there is just do your due diligence, buy them off a reputable supplier, go and visit the project yourself, just to be satisfied that it's doing what you're saying it is. Then focus on, where the project's there with the co-benefits, because there's just such an incredible opportunity to go beyond a ton of carbon and deliver so many environmental and social benefits as a consequence of those projects. I hope that we don't get to net zero without at least using some offsets, because it gives us an opportunity to be investing in those really important, positive impact projects, if you like.
So how has the your carbon neutral status and also the carbon neutral beers been received in the market? What are your customers' reactions to the carbon neutrality? How or has it elevated your brand? And do you use it to differentiate yourself in the market?
So yes, we're seeing good signs for both Fat Tire in the US, which saw an immediate bump in terms of sales. And, Fat Tire, there's a website, drinksustainably.com. I'm not sure if you can put that in your post, but that's the New Belgium website that they set up when they took Fat Tire to carbon neutral. And after that, they did a beer called Scorched Earth. And it was basically only using the ingredients that would be available if, the ravages of climate change, ran out and all we had to make beer bitter were daisies, or we had the only malt that we had available was this really, bad quality 6-row malt that we had to use because we didn't have anything else. So they actually brewed this beer and they put it on the market deliberately, knowing that it tasted bad and people wouldn't buy it. And then they ran a full page ad in the New York Times with this particular product, But it wasn't so much about the beer. It's actually about all the Fortune 500 companies that didn't have a climate change plan. And so if you actually looked at the advertisement and you clicked through, you found yourself at a spot where they were basically targeting the companies that hadn't developed a sufficient climate change plan. So really clever advocacy. So I feel that when you talk about carbon neutral, even organisational products, you're unlocking benefits you haven't even thought about yet, right? It's making changes that haven't yet, being visualised. It's just these little subtle changes in people's behaviour or subtle changes in people's thinking that over time, ultimately you'd hope translates to sales and brand loyalty. But it's also translating to improving people's awareness and, maybe even them, looking at their options to, reduce their own carbon footprint. So I suspect it will, as I said, we've seen good signs that it is making a difference in terms of the brand loyalty and the sales, but we also mindful that it'll take time, and also mindful we can have a lot of fun along the way as well, knowing that we've got the integrity to be highlighting other companies that maybe aren't doing as well as some of the others.
Do you feel like you're an early adopter in this space?
Well, technically, yes. But I feel that it was always, when I pitched it to the executive team in Lion, it was always pitched as the beginning. It was just a step change in our climate leadership. And as I said, it gave us a license to be having the conversations that you and I are having now, but, it gives us a license to go into other boardrooms and have a conversation around what climate leadership looks like and, what we would expect from our suppliers or how we might want to assist our customers to be more responsible. So yes, we are, but I still feel we have so much we could be doing.
We talked about how carbon neutrality has been received by our customers. What about staff? Do they feel more motivated or proud to be part of Lion? You've got so many sustainability initiatives going at Lion. How does that, you mentioned previously the meetings that you have in the factories where people are really motivated to find efficiency opportunities and other initiatives that make Lion even more sustainable. Can you tell us a bit more about how staff has reacted to all those initiatives and whether you see your staff as brand ambassadors?
Oh, look, staff at Lion are in general quite a proud bunch of people. They're very humble, but they're quite proud as well. So I know for a fact they were really excited to see us commit to a carbon neutral organisation. They knew that we had done the biogas, we'd done the on-site solar, the PPAs and the energy efficiency. So in a sense, this was just a way of saying, we're not stopping there. We're going to continue to accelerate action, and the carbon neutral commitment was a good way to demonstrate that. So, and also they were, very interested in the offsets and the types of co-benefits that they were delivering. So, I dare say that, they are very proud of the outcome, and I think it has been motivating for them. And, we have a leadership principle. We have quite a few leadership principles in Lion, but one that has survived the various iterations of leadership principles has been do the right thing for the long term. And it's a principle that always comes up when we're talking about sustainability projects, and people believe in that principle because they've seen the company stand behind that principle. So I feel that, when you look at initiatives like the PPA and you look at initiatives like carbon neutral, be it organisation or products, you can point to that and say, that's Lion doing the right thing for the long term. So it all fits really neatly. And I think that's and it's a good question because it touches on the other benefits of carbon neutral in that it does attract talent to the organisation, and I think it helps us. I'd like to think it helps us retain talent within the organisation as well. So I think when people are looking at, what's their career path, increasingly the younger generations are wanting to work for companies that are seen to be responsible. And when you can point to those types of genuine achievements, it can make the difference in those types of decisions.
Definitely. So Justin, Lion is working on so many great initiatives, starting from regenerative agriculture through to your operational initiatives in terms of efficiency and solar, biogas, your PPA, through to downstream emissions such as educating your customers and your transport emissions. There are so many initiatives. You mentioned that one of the next things that you'll be focusing on more is partnerships, which ties neatly into SDG 17. What are the next steps in Lion's sustainability journey?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that, in fact, I think only a couple of weeks ago, our CEO challenged us with as to what's next. And I think I've probably given it away today, in that it's around our partnerships. It's around how do we amplify our impact through the collaboration with our value chain. And as I said, we're fortunate that we've got a handful of big suppliers that we can work with. We've been working with for a long time to date, but we can at least start to talk about sustainability and where the opportunities may be. So, and you're right, it starts with a conversation, and there's an element of carbon data exchange, which you've got to work through to be able to quantify the benefits of your collaboration. So you kind of get that technical element underway. You agree what's in and what's out and how you're going to measure it, and then that's when the fun starts as to, well, what are the projects out there that we can work together on. So, and we're seeing that in New Belgium, where they're actually paying a consultant to go into their suppliers' businesses and identify energy reduction opportunities. So there's an example where we're directly investing into identifying, carbon reduction in our suppliers in the US.
By reducing their scope 1 and scope 2, you're automatically reducing your scope 3.
That's right. But you know what? And that's how most people, your reaction's completely normal, and that's how people think of it. They think of it as transaction and a carbon budget. But ultimately, what people don't realise is that when you're having those conversations, you're starting a dialogue about, where's the vision, where's the innovation, where's the really big opportunities to collaborate to make an impact. And really, the other thing you've got to think about is that's your role modelling leadership, right? You're basically setting an example to other industries to say, sit down with your supplier, put in place a framework to talk about your carbon footprints, and then discuss ways and means to, be reducing your collective impact. So it's a really fresh area, and it's unusual for companies to want to be transparent, and it's unusual for them to be able to have an open book on what the commercial implications of those discussions might look like. But we often talk about, what does that future contract look like between you and a supplier? Do you actually have to put in clauses there which allow this type of open dialogue? You have to break down those conventions that it's all about getting the cheapest price for a particular supply. So again, it's just taking a nice gentle step into that territory, because ultimately we can't do it by ourselves. We have to share the burden, and that's where the next opportunities are going to come from. So that was one, in terms of what the future looks like. And two, again, it's positive impact, which I've spoken about previously. And one mechanism through which to achieve that is really smart carbon offset projects and really clever strategic carbon offset projects. So that's an area that, we'd really like to push into. And you can see IKEA is a really good example of, if you look at their sustainability report, very heavy emphasis on, positive impact, going beyond zero harm and doing the next best thing.
So we've heard so much about the amazing sustainability initiatives you have on at Lion. What would be the key takeaway message you want to leave our listeners with, looking at all your successes that you've achieved and the challenges you've encountered? What's the key takeaway message?
I feel that we've never been closer to solving climate change. I feel now that all the tools that we need are within reach. And but not only that, through those mechanisms, we've got this incredible opportunity to be regenerating ecosystems and restoring natural systems whilst going about solving climate change. So whilst we can't take our eyes off, reducing emissions and being mindful of the social equity issues that, are also, for me, a big challenge we're facing in today's world. But we need to be positive. We need to really take this opportunity to do so much more beyond climate change. Because, as I said, I feel that the tools are there. We've left it too late. We know that, and there's going to be a few bumps along the way. But we'll get there, and we'll be better for it for sure.
Definitely, I hope so. So, how can people connect with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. So yeah, if this is discussions created any burning questions, that people can find me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to start a conversation.
Thank you so much for your time today, Justin.
No problem, Barbara. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
That was Justin Merrell, Group Environment Director at Lion, talking about their journey to net zero emissions. If you know another person who you think will enjoy this podcast, please let them know so that more people can hear about best practice stories of how organizations are moving to net zero emissions. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.